about a month ago, I did a story about how I was digging through some old boxes in my basement, and I came across an old photograph of myself and a spelling bee when I was in 5th grade, maybe 6th grade, something like that. And I mentioned that I dug through that box the first time in years looking for something else, which I found. But I also found some other cool stuff, and I found something that I thought was gone forever. And now this is going to be interesting. I think if you hang in with me on this one for a second, you're going to understand why this is so cool. And I wrote a book about the development of these cars. That's a Dodge Daytona. There's also a Plymouth Superbird. It looked a lot like it. That's a 69. The Superbird is 1970. And Chrysler made those to race in NASCAR, Dodge and Plymouth, respectively. And so those were developed by a couple guys at Chrysler primarily, including a man named John Pointer. And John Pointer was a physicist who had been working in the Chrysler Missile Division, and he had been laid off when Chrysler started getting away from rockets and moving more towards cars in the 60s as the space race slowed down. And he went to work for automotive. And somebody in the racing division, a guy named Larry Rathgeb, went to him and said, "Hey, you're an aerodynamics guy, right? Could you help us make cars go faster?" And he said, "Of course I could." And he was one of two guys who suggested putting a nose cone and a wing on a car to make it go faster. And I interviewed John Pointer back in the 1990s. And I interviewed him at length. He lived in Ann Arbor at the time. And I called him up. We met for lunch, and I recorded the conversation. Now, I recorded it on a digital recorder. I'm not even sure what format it was in. And I transferred that digital recording to a disc or something, and it's long since gone. And I feel bad about that because he's passed away now. And that was the last time I saw him, was that interview I had with him. And so since then, I've published a bunch of stuff about this, and I've talked a lot about John Pointer, and I often refer back to things I wrote about him. And I always assumed that interview was gone forever because I was pretty sure that the digital interview audio was missing. And going through this box, I found a stack of papers nailed together with a staple titled John Pointer. And I realized that I'd done something that I often did when I was in trial. If I had a deposition with somebody or I'd interviewed somebody, I would often make a note and write out in statement form things they told me, so I'd know the answers to questions I was going to ask. So for instance, I have here John Pointer, graying hair and a mustache, carrying a walking stick with a silver handle on it, wearing a VMI belt buckle. And that's how he was dressed when I met him. And he went to VMI. That's where he got one of his degrees. In physics, he worked for the Chrysler Missile Division, and Chrysler laid off 11,000 workers. And he had at one time or another worked with Jupiter and Redstone. And he said that they developed the aerodynamic testing of a car on the road with enough accuracy so that we could cheat at stock car racing and get away with it. That's a quote. And I'll put it in quotes if it's an actual quote. Otherwise, I'm simply summarizing what he said. So he said he scoured the libraries of all the local universities and couldn't find anything in a month of searching the literature for aerodynamics in cars because people hadn't worried about that just yet. And so he said, well, if I try and fail, I've got a lot of good, high-placed company. And if I try and succeed, maybe I'll be a hero. And he said, and this is a quote I used in my book, the original recipe for a NASCAR stocker was the biggest engine you could find, stuffed in the smallest car you could lay your hands on, and you cram a great, big, brave hillbilly behind the wheel, and you go racing. And that was how he described Chrysler's entries in 1964 when they had Hemi-powered Plymouths, which was a small car, lightweight car with a gigantic engine and a big, brave hillbilly behind the wheel. He did say those cars were frightening to drive because apparently he tried it once or twice. A lot of people don't realize that Daytona back then was not perfectly smooth, the track, and there was a dip along one of the straightaways. And if you didn't hit it straight, your car could go airborne and come down sideways. So he went to Chrysler in 1964, and he said that he became aware very quickly of all the stuff that's happening. And he was the one who said, hey, we need to test these cars in wind tunnels to find out what we can do. They started wind tunnel testing cars at Wichita State using a university wind tunnel. I've got pictures of that, by the way, in one of my books, not with John Pointer in them, but simply the tests they were doing. And he said the aero testing first appeared on a car that Petty drove, and he said they were fudging bodywork. They discovered that if they simply just reshaped a couple angles on the fenders, they could make the cars go faster. So he goes, the fenders would curve inwards at the front, and the hoods would curve downward. So at the front, they'd go like this and then downward. And he said that helped them win. He said the 1966 Charger was the first spoiler approved by NASCAR, and that's true. Up until then, wind tunnel testing had never looked at the yaw, which, of course, I believe is the side-to-side action of a car. And they were worrying about that, of course, going into the corners. He said that he worked with a driver named Sam McQuagg for a while, who had such a heavy accent he had a hard time understanding the guy speaking. So the guy would go and do a few laps, and John Pointer would ask him what happened. And he had to repeat it several times because he couldn't understand the guy. He said the way they tested and measured the handling of the car was to measure tire temperatures after laps. They would test to see if the front tires were hotter than the rear, because if they were, the car was understeering, and the rears were running hotter, it was oversteering. And so they actually would do that, and that's fascinating to me. The fastback of the 1966 Charger wanted to pick the back end up because the back was sloped, and it created a bit of an airfoil. He said the net result of that car was it was hideously unstable, and all we needed to do to balance the car was put an 1.5-inch spoiler on it. But of course, at that time, NASCAR wouldn't let you put a spoiler on a car unless it was part of the actual car being sold to the public. Now, the Hemi got outlawed after it had been introduced. There's a whole story behind that. And I'll skip over some of this stuff because it's very, very obscure. But he did say unwritten law of NASCAR is you win if you can, lose if you must, but you always cheat. The 68 Dodge Charger, which was a rebody from 67 and 66, he said had problems with the front end lifting. The front end would want to get off the ground. And he said that Buddy Baker actually went out and drove and came back and goes, guys, this car is scaring me. So they started testing putting front air dams, which were a spoiler underneath the nose of the car, and that would help pull the front end down and get the air from getting underneath the car. And they weren't sure if NASCAR was going to allow them, and so they did all kinds of different things testing on this stuff, but they finally did get NASCAR to allow them. And he said that he went down there during early part of Speed Week, I believe in 68, and the Chargers were running between 183 and 184, but the problem is that the Fords were running 187 to 189. And he said, of course, over a long race, that's a lot of daylight on the track. So he said, you got to go reduce the drag and reduce the lift. And so when asked what he would do, he said, put the nose cone and the wing on, and he drew it out on a napkin. And Larry Rathgeb said that he had asked two different people that they both did the exact same thing. So he said that the nose cone and the wing were there because, quote, we were desperate. So he said they started hammering on the sheet metal in January. He had a manager out of the Proving Grounds in Chelsea, was on vacation for the whole month of January. The performance department really couldn't do much of anything in January because of the snow. So he said they were using panels, angle iron, and Bondo. And he said they were actually mocking up nose cones and wings. And when the boss walked out the first time, he said he almost swallowed his cigar. But he said, hey, if this will win races, no one will care. Meanwhile, there were scoops over the front tires on those two cars. And there's been a lot of debate about that. But they told NASCAR it was so that the tires would have more clearance. And he said, yeah, that's one of the things it did do. And he said, however, there was an overall reduction in drag, i.e. they did something besides just tire clearance. We know that's a fact now, too. But he was, I don't think he wanted to admit that to me. I think he was actually kind of like, well, it did reduce drag, but it was for tire clearance. So he said that he set out to make sure that they're doing what they could. And so they did make a Charger 500, an interim car where they plugged the nose cone of the, or they plugged the nose, the grill of the car, and changed the backlight. But he said, when I was a kid growing up, I wanted to be a stylist. I said, this is my chance. Now, this wasn't styling, this was design, because there's intent behind everything on this car. And then he complained. I asked him about the Superbird compared to the Daytona. And the Superbird wing actually leans back a little farther. It actually looks better than most people think. But he said, yeah, that was the designers because they wanted to make the car look prettier. But it did not make the car go faster. So the Daytona Charger, the wing ran into the frame rail. It could withstand up to 400 pounds of downforce. And he said, yeah, two grown men could sit on it. Now, we've all seen pictures of women sitting on it, but I've also seen pictures of men sitting on it. So it is metal. It's not fiberglass, it's metal. So they ran the car by everybody else. And when people saw how fast it was, kind of like everything went out the window. He did say he didn't like the stripe on the back quarter that ran down from the wing. He said the stripe was stupid. The car was already too long, and the stripe made it look longer. Now, I like the stripe, but hey, that's a matter of taste. So he did say that as a designer at Chrysler, he went to Daytona a couple of times, and he was aware of the problems that Talladega had surfacing their track. And he said that Bobby Isaac could have won the race at Talladega in the fall of 1969, but he got greedy, and that caused him to wear his tires out too fast. So that's a problem. He said that they did test the car in Michigan in January, and they're running the cars outside in freezing temperatures, and everyone froze except for the driver because they let the driver wear a snowmobile suit. So I asked John, I said, hey, John, did you ever drive one of these cars at speed? And he said he drove once at 185 miles an hour. Instruments had been removed, and the car was going to be shipped to Daytona for more testing, and he hadn't driven it before, and he said he was scared, but he'd try it. The last day, his boss asked if he could drive it before he left, so they all took turns, and so he said, you know something? I'll try it too. So he said that at the time, I guess he's in his mid-30s. I think that's what that means, my handwritten notes here. And he said that, but doing the calculations, he was doing 185 miles an hour in the straightaway. He did say, believe it or not, that one of his last jobs working aerodynamics at Chrysler was on the Viper. He actually worked with the Viper. And he told me at the time, he goes, the Viper, like the one I've got, it's got a hard top. Prior to that, they had an open top version of it. And they also continued selling it as an open top. He goes, with the open top, that car was hideously unstable at high speeds. But you just don't ever drive it over the speed limit. It says that whenever he sees a Daytona or Superbird, it would take him back. And by the way, he talked about how Chrysler Engineering built a car that was owned by Chrysler. But they painted it up and made it look like it belonged to Cotton Owens so Buddy Baker could drive it. And they referred to that as the Baker car, the 88 car. But that was actually the Chrysler Engineering car. And it got entered in races. And it shouldn't have been because it was a factory-owned car. But he said, and this is a quote, we were putting a fast one over on Bill France. So that's the one where Bill France later asked if he could have the car for his museum. And Chrysler had already sold the car. So they decided to repaint the car, one of the other cars they had, and send it to Bill France, who wouldn't know the difference. And they sent him a different car. There's pictures of Bill France being presented with this car that's not the correct car. And he did say, and I'm trying to think if I can say this properly, but he said that's their way of giving Bill France the finger. And he said that because Bill France had outlawed these cars in 1971, in essence. And so they put all this work into developing them. They ran them for a year and a half, and then they got outlawed. And then Bill France goes, but can I have one for my museum? Oh, now you want one. So he did say that he did not work that much with Harry Hyde or Bobby Isaac, who is, of course, the guy who raced that car right there, and Harry Hyde was his crew chief. But he did say that he did work with him occasionally when asked for help, and they were doing things like figuring out like what angle to have the car ride at with the suspension and so on. So Bobby Isaac had said, you know, as long as you make it go fast, I don't care. And then I asked him specifically about his military service, because he mentioned that he'd been in the military. He was a tank platoon leader in Korea. He was the leader of a tank platoon. And he was in a Patton tank. And he said that he was occasionally around the DMZ. And he said that they had some very, very exciting times back there in Korea in the tank. And he told me some more stories about that also. But here's the thing. John Pointer was one of the most fascinating guys I ever met. I've read a lot of interviews he gave other people. I just read the interview right now that he gave me. I spent probably a couple hours with him. And he's one of those guys that the more I talked to him, the more I realized that this guy's a walking, like, library museum of knowledge of this stuff. And I would ask him, did you ever meet this guy? Did you ever meet that guy? Oh, yeah, I met that guy. Oh, yeah, I met this. And he'd tell you stories about it. And they're fascinating stories. But he was there at the moment in time when NASCAR, in essence, became modern. Because before 1967, let's say 68, nobody thought much about aerodynamics. It was just get bigger and more powerful engines. Bigger engines, bigger engines, bigger engines. And physicists will tell you that as you're pushing something through the air, the resistance to it starts rising, and it ain't a straight line graph. To the point where it's just as efficient, if not more so, to simply make what you're pushing more aerodynamic as opposed to just putting in more horsepower. And so by putting the nose cone and the wing on that car is the equivalent of handling the car like a couple hundred more horsepower. It was crazy. It was such a huge change. And so look at the cars from mid-1960s to the cars from the mid-1970s, and you see the cars look completely different. And so NASCAR finally had to cave in and just say, well, look, people want faster cars. So we got to let them do what will make the cars go fast, and that's aerodynamics. We got to let them do that. But the downside of that, of course, is that NASCAR now, when you look at the cars on the track, you don't know what it's supposed to be without reading the emblem, because they all kind of look alike. They all do, and so stock car racing ain't stock anymore. But this was a response to the idea that we had to have a car that we sell to the public that we then race. So they built a race car, sold it to the public, and then took it to NASCAR. And Bill France let him do that for, like I said, about a year and a half. And then he said, okay, we can't do this anymore. We got to get rid of the exotic body styles. So there's more to it than that. Like I said, I've written a whole bunch of stuff about this. But it was so fascinating to me that I found this. I'm like, I forgot I did that. And I have my notes from that book, but that's not where I found these. I found these in a different box. So these are the notes from my interview with John Pointer, like I said, in the mid-1990s. And I met him at a restaurant in Ann Arbor. And he strolled in, the mustache and the walking stick, and I go, hey, there's John Pointer. And he's a great guy. And he's one of these guys who, I don't think that he cared all that much about cars until he was asked about it. And then when he realized nobody had done this before, he thought, oh, cool. This is a fascinating idea that I get to be the one, or one of the guys, who looks at this from a whole new angle and actually gets to change the shape of things to come. So he's one of the guys directly responsible for that car looking like that. And so I love those cars. I've written all about the cars. John Pointer is a great guy. He's passed away. But it was like finding a lost relic when I found this, or like one of the lost books of the Bible or something. And whoa, my notes from my John Pointer interview. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.